Okay, this video is concerning the U.S. bankruptcy. This is an article by Moses G. Washington. Uh, Basically, the United States is bankrupt, and it has been for a very long time. And this article does a great job of demonstrating that for us, so I'm just going to start reading. In this article, we examine the evidence that the United States government is in bankruptcy and the implications for all Americans. Before we begin tracing the events demonstrating that bankruptcy exists, allow me to quote from a fairly recent congressional record. Quote, Mr. Speaker, we are here now in Chapter 11. Members of Congress are official trustees presiding over the greatest reorganization of any bankrupt entity in world history, the U.S. government. We are setting forth, hopefully, a blueprint for our future. There are some who say it's a coroner's report that will lead to our demise, unquote. And that's Representative James Traficant, addressing the House Congressional Record, March 17th, 1993, Volume 33, page H-1303. And of course, they're talking about Chapter 11, bankruptcy. Members of Congress are trustees, and they are presiding over the greatest reorganization of any bankrupt entity in the world. So the U.S. government at that time, in 1993, was the biggest bankrupt entity in the world. Evidence demonstrating the bankruptcy. If in fact a bankruptcy exists, one would expect to find evidence of it in our various government records. The evidence from these sources suggests that the bankruptcy was precipitated by the stock market crash of 1929. So we will begin our search here. In 1929, the United States entered the Great Depression. At that time, most of the major economic and military powers in the world were also in the Depression. You may recall that Americans were permitted to own gold, that our currency was backed by gold and silver. People could deposit their gold in Federal Reserve banks, and the bank would give them a note which they could use to withdraw their gold. Due to the panic in the economic markets after the crash in 1929, people were trying to withdraw the funds from the banks in the form of currency of silver and gold. President Herbert Hoover asked the Federal Reserve Board of New York for a recommendation on how to deal with the situation. One might wonder why President Hoover would ask the Federal Reserve for advice, but a review the Federal Reserve article will show that the Federal Reserve was in control of our monetary policy. The Federal Reserve Board adopted a resolution to respond to President Hoover's request. Quote, resolution adopted by the Federal Reserve Board of New York, whereas, in the opinion of the Board of Directors of the Federal Bank of New York, the continued and increasing withdrawal of currency and gold from the banks of the country has now created a national emergency. Herbert Hoover's private papers of March 3rd, 1933. So this is the excuse that they used to create a national emergency, because people had deposited their gold in the bank, and then they were trying to get it out, and the banks didn't have the gold because they do the fractional reserve banking, where they only keep about 10% of the deposit, and they loan out the rest of it and charge interest on it. Bunch of thieves going on. The Federal Reserve Board is stating that the run on banks is causing a national emergency. Since our currency was backed by gold, why would it cause a national emergency for the people to hold the gold rather than the banks? To find the answer, let's see what President Hoover had to say. Quote, that those spectator and insiders were right and plain enough later on. This first contract of the money changers with the New Deal settled those who removed their money from the country a profit of up to 60% when the dollar was debased, unquote. And that's from the Hoover Policy Paper, written by the Secretary of Interior and Secretary of Agriculture. So even up to that point, when the New Deal settled, those who removed their money from the country a profit of up to 60% when the dollar was debased. So when the money changers contracted with the government with the New Deal, they took a bunch of money out of the country. Okay, President Hoover is saying that those with inside knowledge had already removed the money, gold, from the country before the American people started demanding their money from the banks. Since the banks didn't have the gold the people were demanding, the banks needed protection. So the Federal Reserve Board went on to propose that the president issue an executive order based on the Trading with the Enemy Act of 1917 as follows. Okay, so the Trading with the Enemy Act was enacted in World War I period to discourage people from trading with the declared enemies of the United States during that war period, to prevent companies and corporations from doing dealings with enemies, cutting off supplies to all the people who were aggressors. And so basically what they're going to do here is they're going to amend this act and include me and you in it, U.S. citizens. So, quote, whereas it is provided in Section 5B of the Act of October 6, 1917, as amended, that the President may investigate, regulate, or prohibit under such rules and regulations as he may prescribe by means of licensure or otherwise, and transaction in foreign exchange and the export, hoarding, melting, or earmarking of gold or silver coin or bullion or currency, unquote. Herbert Hoover's private papers of March 3rd, 1933. So that is the proposed amendment to the Trading with the Enemy Act to deal with that emergency. If the country has an enemy, if the creditors have an enemy, they're going to have to use the state to subdue that enemy from becoming violent mobs. President Hoover declined to issue the order, but Franklin Delano Roosevelt was inaugurated as president on March 4th, 1933. In his inauguration speech, requested that Congress grant him emergency powers equal to those he might have in times of war to allow him to deal with the crisis. On March 5th, 1933, he issued Proclamation 2038, requesting a special session of Congress beginning on March 9th, 1933, to deal with the banking emergency. Then, on March 6, 1933, President Roosevelt issued Proclamation 2039 to indicate to Congress what kind of emergency powers he was asking for. This proclamation had exactly the same wording as the proposed by the Federal Reserve Board, but the proclamation had no authority until Congress met to give him the required authority. For a more detailed account of these events, read the article on War and Emergency Powers. One might well ask how the Federal Reserve Board could make such influence over the president. Some researchers speculate that the Depression was engineered by the Federal Reserve and the international bankers that they represent. The bankers' motive was to further consolidate. They already had controlled the monetary policy of the United States to consolidate that power. It is also speculated that the government was told that it could cooperate with the Federal Reserve, the international bankers, or the Depression would remain indefinitely. Under such political blackmail, the President, Congress, and courts were willing to acquiesce to the demands of the bankers. Bear these speculations in mind as you read how quickly the Federal Reserve got what it wanted. These speculations will be an area for further research. So the bankers basically had the country by the balls financially, like they do all the time. That's what their MO is. That's how they operate. So that's why we see what we see today with the military police and all that. People have no rights because A, they don't know their rights, are stupid, they're dumbed down, and B, they don't care, and C, we're slaves. Okay, so the very first act passed by Congress when they met in special session has the following preamble, quote, be it enacted by the Senate and the House of Representatives of the United States of America in Congress assembled, that the Congress hereby declares that a serious emergency exists and that it is imperatively necessary speedily to put into effect remedies of uniform national application, unquote. On the first day of the special session, Congress approved Proclamation 2039, On the same day, President Roosevelt reissued it as Proclamation 2040, quote, whereas under the Act of March 9th, 1933, all proclamations heretofore or hereafter issued by the President pursuant to the authority enforced by Section 5B of the Act of October 6, 1917, as amended, are approved and confirmed. And that's President Roosevelt's Proclamation 2040. So basically, what he did was he made a proclamation where, under the Act of March 9th, 1933, which was an amendment to the Trading with the Enemy Act, that amendment that declared basically all U.S. citizens as enemies of the state because of the emergency. This act makes it so that all proclamations heretofore and hereafter issued, and then all this crap in between, are amended and approved and confirmed. So basically what he did, precisely what he did was he claimed military dictatorial status and did away with the Constitution completely. And as a military dictator now, all the proclamations that the president can make are amended and approved and confirmed without anybody else having anything to say about it. So going on the same day, Congress passed the following statute, quote, during time of war or during any other period of national emergency declared by the President may, through any agency that he may designate or otherwise investigate, regulate, or prohibit under such rules and regulations as he may prescribe by means of licensure or otherwise, any transaction in foreign exchange, transactions of credit between or payments by banking institutions as defined by the President, and export, hoarding, melting, or earmarkings of gold or silver, corn or bullion or currency by any person within the United States or any place subject to the jurisdiction of. Okay, so basically what that really does is that makes it basically impossible to export your gold and silver. Okay, this is exactly the same language that was found in the 1917 Trading with the Enemy Act, with the exception of the section in bold. Okay, by any person within the United States or any place subject to the jurisdiction thereof. That's like 14th Amendment language. Any person that's a United States citizen. So, that's a slave status. This is exactly the same language that was found in the 1917 Trading with the Enemy Act, with the exception of the section in bold. The exclusion of transactions within the United States had been removed from the Act. This statute can now be found in the United States Code at 12 USC 95B. This is the current version of the statute. Notice that the wording is almost identical to that found in the 1933 statute, which was the one shown above. Okay, Section 95B, ratification of acts of President and Secretary of the Treasury under Section 95A. The actions, regulations, rules, licenses, orders, and proclamations heretofore or hereafter taken, promulgated, made, or issued by the President of the United States or the Secretary of the Treasury since March 4th, 1933, pursuant to the authority conferred by Section 95A of this title, are approved and confirmed. Yeah, so they kind of just softened it up a little bit and made it a little bit more modern, I suppose, but it's pretty much the same. All it's saying is the ratification, they just kind of ratified it and made it a little softer, and they just basically they're dictator. It's all military. It's all military. It's conquered. We're conquered nation, and in bankruptcy. Going on, this version says that the authority is granted in 12 USC 95A, but if you look in those notes to the statute, you will see that the original source authority is located in October 6, 1917, Chapter 106, Section 5B, 40 Stat 415, and later in March 9th, 1933, Chapter 1, Title 1, Section 2, 48 Stat 1. So the President still has the authority as it was originally granted in 1917 and later modified in 1933. The effect of this emergency power is that all Americans are now part of the Trading with the Enemy Act as amended in 1933. The significance of this change will become apparent shortly. Since the banks didn't have gold to pay out, President Roosevelt used Proclamation 2039 and 2040, along with the provisions of 12 USC 95B, to create a banking holiday. This can be verified if we read the definition of banking holiday of 1933. Okay, this is the power of legal language. This is why you gotta understand your legalese and get your Black's Law Dictionary and actually look in it and read the words and look these things up, look these phrases up, because banking holiday sounds pretty cool. Let's take a day off, but it's let's read what it really means. Quote: Bank holiday of 1933, Presidential Proclamations number 2039, issued March 6, 1939, and number 2040 issued, well, that should say March 6, 1933. Whoever typed this is an idiot. And number 2040 issued March 9th, 1933. Temporarily suspended banking transactions by member banks of the Federal Reserve System. Normal banking functions were resumed on March 13th, subject to certain restrictions. The first proclamation it was held had no authority in law until the passage on March 9th, 1933 of a ratified act. The present law forbids member banks of the Federal Reserve System to transact banking business except under regulations of the Secretary of the Treasury during an emergency proclaimed by the President. Okay, so that's all martial law, basically, military, and they took the real money. So the banks don't deal in gold and silver anymore, and you can't take your Federal Reserve notes into a bank and say, I'd like to have silver or gold for this. They'll laugh at you because it's paper, it's bills of exchange. It's not real. It's not a real money. So really, I mean, you got to understand that there's really actually no money. There's no real money because if you look up the term money, it's actual real value. There's actual real value there. There's no value of paper notes. It's all an IOU. It's basically a promise to pay. And because we're in a bankruptcy and there's no real money, it's all debt. So when the Federal Reserve issues the currency, when they issue the money, they're just issuing debt. And so that's pretty much the remedy for not having any real money, is to be able to discharge our debt. Okay, the restrictions mentioned in the above definitions are that the banks had to be licensees before they could be reopened. So of course they had to license with the military government because at that point they were deriving a benefit. A license is something which grants authority to do something that would otherwise be illegal, trading or conducting business with the enemy. Americans on American soil was made an illegal activity unless licensed. Okay, so they had the benefit of dealing with the enemy, basically. President Roosevelt's paper revealed that the government will grant the license. Quote, the Secretary of the Treasury will issue licenses to banks which are members of the Federal Reserve System, whether national bank or state, located in each of the 12 Federal Reserve Bank cities to open Monday morning, unquote. Okay, so continuing going on. Another provision passed on March 9th, 1933 gave Federal Reserve agents the authority to act as agents of the U.S. Department of Treasury. This seemed very strange since the Federal Reserve is a private business. Quote, when required to do so by the Secretary of Treasury, each Federal Reserve agent shall act as an agent of the Treasurer of the United States or of the comptroller of the currency, or both, for the performances of any functions which the Treasurer or the comptroller may be called upon to perform in carrying out the provisions of this paragraph. So that literally gives the Federal Reserve agents power over the Treasury of the United States. That's why a lot of people say that the Treasury of the United States doesn't even exist, because it's it's de facto. It's completely, everything is. It's all color law. It's all de facto, and that goes for the government as well. Because it's bankrupt, it only exists in name. We've already seen that insiders had removed most of the gold from the banks before the American people started demanding their money from the banks. Since the banks didn't have the money the people were demanding, the banks needed protection. In order to do this, the American people had to be declared the enemy. The Trading with the Enemy Act, as revised in 1933, accomplished this. Then Congress passed a statute which authorized stiff fines and or prison sentences if the people didn't turn in the gold. Quote, whenever in the judgment of the Secretary of the Treasury such action is necessary to protect the currency system of the United States, the Secretary of the Treasury, in his discretion, may regulate any or all individuals, partnerships, associations, and corporations to pay and deliver to the Treasurer of the United States any or all gold coin, gold bullion, and gold certificates owned by such individuals, partnerships, associations, corporations, and persons, U.S. citizens. Whoever shall not comply with the provision of this act shall be fined not more than $10,000, or if any natural person may in addition to such fine be imprisoned for a year not exceeding 10 years. So if you don't turn in your gold, we're going to fine you $10,000, and we're going to potentially put you in prison for 10 years. So turn in your gold under duress and false imprisonment. So not only were American citizens not able to get their gold, but their gold was confiscated by the government. Since all money was gold and silver certificates, and all of this money had to be turned in, the people were left without any money. Okay, because the people were used as collateral for the debt. You know, I mean, and this the bankruptcy goes back a long way. It goes really back to basically just after the beginning of the country, they became bankrupt. I mean, the Constitution is basically a debt instrument, and it, you know, sets up to constitute something. A constitutor is to somebody who takes on the debt of somebody else, according to Black's Law Dictionary, 6th edition. And so it was martial law and debt based from the beginning. But you know, it's been bankrupt multiple times. It was bankrupt before the time of the Civil War. That was a big commercial transaction. You know, and of course they brainwash us and make it all about race and stuff. But it's really a banker's revolution if you really look behind the scenes. And then we have, you know, the Revolutionary War, and then, you know, that was kind of color because you know, King George III funded both sides anyway, so it was kind of crazy. But yeah, just kind of getting off track there. But it's been bankrupt many times. Basically, this was probably I've heard that maybe the third or fourth time that it was bankrupt. That would make sense. Quote, during this banking holiday, it was at first believed that some form of script or emergency currency would be necessary for the conduct of ordinary business. We knew that it would be essential when the banks reopened to have an adequate supply of currency to meet all possible demands of depositors. Consideration was given by government officials and various local agencies to the advisability of issuing clearinghouse certificates or some similar form of local emergency currencies. Military script. On March 7, 1933, the Secretary of the Treasury issued a regulation authorizing clearinghouses to issue demand certificates against sound assets of the banking institutions. But this authority was not to become effective until March 10th. In many cities, the printing of these certificates was actually begun. But after the passage of the Emergency Banking Act of March 9, 1933, it became evident that they would not be needed because the act made possible the issue of the necessary amount of emergency currency in the form of Federal Reserve banknotes, which could be based on any sound assets owned by the banks. And really, what Federal Reserve notes have their worth, you know, is based off of U.S. citizens' labor. Really, I mean that, and one of the only assets in the world today, one of the main assets, I should say, is oil. And you know, it's just things like that really back up the worth, if you can call it that, of the Federal Reserve note. So we see that Roosevelt's papers admit that the Emergency Banking Act made it possible to issue emergency currency which was based upon the assets of the bank rather than upon gold or silver, removed the U.S. from the gold standard. The emergency currency was Federal Reserve banknotes. Federal Reserve notes are still used today. Next, we will see what was to be used to back up the Federal Reserve banknotes. Quote, upon the deposit with the Treasurer of the United States, A, of the direct obligations of the United States, or B, of any notes, drafts, bills of exchange, or bankers' acceptances acquired under the provisions of this act. Any Federal Reserve Bank making such deposit in the manner prescribed by the Secretary of Treasury shall be entitled to receive from the comptroller of the currency circulating notes in blank, duly registered and countersigned. So basically, it's backed up with notes, drafts, bills of exchange, bankers' acceptances. So it's kind of, it's crazy. It's just backed up with nothing, paper. Later in 1933, the House of Representatives passed a joint resolution to suspend the gold standard and abrogate the gold clause, which says in part, quote, that A, every provision contained in or made with respect to any obligation which purports to give the obligee a right to require payment in gold or particular kind of coin or currency, or in as amount of money of the United States measured thereby is declared to be against public policy, and in no such provision shall be contained in or made with respect to any obligation hereafter incurred, unquote. And that was House Joint Resolution 192, June 5th, 1933. So a lot was going down in that year, 1933. I like those the numbers, 33. Since this measure was passed as a joint resolution, it does not have the force of law. You will notice that the resolution uses the term public policy. We frequently hear the term public policy used, but what does it mean? Policy, the general principles by which a government is guided in its management of public affairs, unquote. Public policy, broadly, principles and standards regarded by the legislature or by the courts as being a fundamental concern to the state and the whole of society, unquote. Public policy is not the same thing as public law. Public law, the body of law dealing with the relations between private individuals and the government, and with the structure and operation of the government itself. Statute affecting the general public, unquote. And that's Black's Law Dictionary, 7th edition. This is a rather startling admission on the part of Congress. They are saying that what they are doing by refusing to pay the federal debt in gold is not according to the law, but rather a public policy. And the reason for that is because gold, or real money, equal consideration, actually gives you a certain different jurisdictional situation in the courts. You have real money, then you have real government, you have real courts, you have real justice. If you have fake money, script money, you have military tribunals, and you have martial law. So we see that the currency was no longer backed by gold, even if it is only a public policy. The new currency was Federal Reserve Bank notes. These notes were and still are backed by the direct obligations of the United States, which are Treasury notes. They are also backed up by bank notes, drafts, bills of exchange, and bank acceptances. Nothing, paper and paper. This last group are notes, loans that Federal Reserve member banks were holding on loans they had made to people and institutions. So the public or private debt instrument of the banks were considered assets to be deposited in the Treasury in exchange for circulating notes. This can be further proven by excerpts from the congressional record during the debate over the Emergency Banking Act of 1933. So it's all just bills of exchange. It's basically just bills of exchange, and there's no real money. So, okay, and this is a debate. Mr. McFadden, quote, the first section of the bill, as I grasped it, is practically the war powers that were given back in 1917. I would like to ask the chairman of the committee if this is a plan to change the holding of the security back of the Federal Reserve notes to the Treasury of the United States rather than the Federal Reserve agent, unquote. Mr. Stigall, quote, this provision is for the issuance of Federal Reserve Bank notes and not for Federal Reserve notes. And the security back of it is the obligations, notes, drafts, bills of exchange, bank acceptances, outlined in the section to which the gentleman has referred, unquote. McFadden, quote, then the new circulation is to be Federal Reserve Bank notes and not Federal Reserve notes. Is that true, unquote. Stigall, quote, insofar as the provisions of this section are concerned, yes, unquote. Mr. Britton, from my observations of the bill as it was read to the House, it would appear that the amount of banknotes that might be issued by the Federal Reserve System is not limited. That will depend entirely upon the amount of collateral that is presented from time to time from exchange or banknotes. Is that not correct? Unquote. McFadden, yes, that is correct. Unquote. He's basically saying that they can print as much as they want. It should be clear that the currency was no longer backed by gold, but by a promise to pay on various debt instruments, loans to private individuals or businesses, and the government. So there were no hard assets backing up the currency, only promises. In the case of government loans, the collateral would be the full faith and credit of the United States. This is very strong evidence that the federal government was bankrupt at that time. If it weren't, the federal government would still be willing to pay its obligations in gold, and the currency would still be backed by gold. Who did the federal government owe money to? The obvious answer is the Federal Reserve Bank, who was holding the direct obligations of the United States. The Federal Reserve is a private bank. It's not part of the government. The logical conclusion is that the government is bankrupt and the Federal Reserve is the creditor. And, you could say a lot of good things about gold and gold-backed currencies and stuff, but I think it was pointed out in I don't know the exact passage, but I believe it's in Tragedy and Hope by Carroll Quigley, and he talks about how gold was the old banker's plan. Yeah, but anyway, Carroll Quigley talks about that in Tragedy and Hope, about how the gold standard was the old banker ploy because they wanted to get everybody onto one thing, Anyway, the transition from a gold-backed currency to one that was not backed by any hard asset was very swift. The Federal Reserve Board proposed it to President Hoover on March 3, 1933, and it was implemented into law by March 9, 1933. This is a very swift action indeed. How can we account for such a rapid change in circumstances? We have not uncovered, at least thus far, direct evidence of undue influence by the Federal Reserve or the international bankers. However, their position as creditor to the United States does provide a plausible explanation as to why things change so rapidly. The final topic we will explore is the impact of this event on American citizens. Impact of bankruptcy. So let's clarify the difference between real money backed by hard asset and a paper money substitute. Federal Reserve notes are nothing more than promissory notes backed by the United States Treasury securities. A promise to pay the debt to the Federal Reserve Bank. They allow the federal government to create debt, which causes inflation through devaluation of the currency. Inflation occurs whenever there is an increase of the supply of a money supply in the economy without a corresponding increase in the gold-silver backing. Inflation is an invisible form of taxation that irresponsible governments inflict on their citizens. The Federal Reserve Bank has access to an unlimited supply of Federal Reserve notes. The Federal Reserve Bank only pays for the printing cost of new Federal Reserve notes. We also need to understand that there is a fundamental difference between paying and discharging a debt. To pay a debt, you must pay with value or substance, gold, silver, barter, or a commodity. With Federal Reserve notes, you can only discharge a debt. You cannot pay a debt with debt currency system. You cannot service a debt with a currency that has no backing in value or substance. No contract in common law is valid unless it involves an exchange of good and valuable consideration. What does the federal government have to offer the Federal Reserve in payment of its debts? The next quote answers this question. Patent, quote, the money will be worth 100 cents on the dollar because it is backed by the credit of the nation. It would represent a mortgage on all the homes and other property of all the people of the nation, unquote. That comes from Congressional Record, March 9th, 1933. So what they're saying is it'll be worth, all it is worth is because it's backed by all the assets and the people and their labor in themselves. That's why you get taxed so much, because you don't own your own labor. We see that the federal government has offered all of the private property on the nation to its creditor, the Federal Reserve. The government can offer the labor of the people of the nation. Okay, so they offered your property. That's why you have to pay property taxes. It's not your property. It's a yearly rent, and you don't own your own labor. You're a slave. That's why you have to pay 30% of it or more in taxes, because it's really a tribute to the crown. This quote is evidence that the government hypothecated all of the present and future proprieties, assets, and labor of their subjects to the Federal Reserve System. Okay, so hypothecate means to pledge property as security or collateral for a debt. Generally, there is no physical transfer of the pledged property to the lender, nor is the lender given title to the property, though he has a right to sell the pledged property upon default, unquote. So the government has pledged or mortgaged our property as collateral to the creditor, the Federal Reserve. If you thought that the only person who could mortgage a property was the owner, you are correct. The implication is that through some mechanism, which will be the subject of future material on this website, the government has taken over controlling interest in our property. If this is the case, it is a violation of the Fifth Amendment to the Constitution. Nor shall private property be taken for public use without just compensation. You may wonder how you got roped into paying someone else's debt. The answer can be found in the 14th Amendment. The validity of the public debt of the United States shall not be questioned. That's the 14th Amendment, Section 4. After the passage of the 14th Amendment, everyone born in America became a 14th Amendment federal citizen. As such, you are held liable for the public debt of the United States. To provide further evidence of government control of our property, consider the fact that we pay property taxes. Prior to 1913, when the Federal Reserve Act was passed, most Americans owned property and had allodial titles. There are no property taxes in this situation. When we buy property now, we are not given an allodial title. Instead, we are given a title deed, which is not free, simple, absolute. To better understand, it's fee, simple, absolute. To better understand, let's look at the definitions of these terms. Allodial, free, not holden on any lord or superior, owned without obligation of vassalage or fealty. Black's Law, 5th edition. Okay, fee simple. A fee simple absolute is an estate limited absolutely to a man and his heirs and assignees forever without limitation or condition. An absolute or fee simple estate is one in which the owner is entitled to the entire property with unconditional power of disposition during his life and descending it to heirs and legal representatives upon his death, intestate, unquote. Black's Law, 5th edition. So that's how the Roman Catholic Church does everything. You know, they own their property. They actually own it. That's what this is talking about. It's talking about real ownership, not like the color of ownership that we have nowadays. People think they own their property. They don't own their property. Deed, a conveyance of realty, a writing signed by grantor, whereby title to realty is transferred from one another. Black's Law, 5th edition. Title deeds, deeds which constitute or are the evidence of title to lands. Black's Law, 5th edition. From these definitions, it should be obvious that we do not have fee simple absolute title to our land. If we had an allodial title without obligation, no one would have the authority to tax the land. They would also not have a right to sell the property if the taxes weren't paid. But when the property was hypothecated, the government took that authority. The title deed is evidence that a title doesn't exist. But the question remains, who holds title to the property? It would seem that the government has taken control of our property and that they lease it back to us for what is called property taxes. In return for turning over all the property in the U.S., the Federal Reserve Bank agreed to extend the federal government all the credit, money substitute, it needed. Like any other debtor, the federal government had to assign collateral and security to their creditors as a condition of the loan. Since the federal government didn't have any assets, they assigned the private property of their economic slaves, the United States citizens, as collateral against the unpayable federal debt. They also pledged the unincorporated federal territories, national parks, and forests as collateral against the federal debt. For evidence of this, see the United Nations plaques in most of major national parks. You may say, I don't feel like an economic slave. If not, then why are most Americans mortgaged to the hilt and have little or no assets after all debts and liabilities have been paid? Why does it feel like you are working harder and harder and getting less and less? Evidence of your economic slavery is the fact that you pay Social Security taxes and income taxes. Remember that we said the federal government could also pledge the labor of the citizens. The federal government gets the benefit of your labor in the form of federal employment income taxes. What you may not know is that the federal government does not have constitutional authority to tax your wages. So the income tax is voluntary. And they're not even wages. It's when you go to work and you work and you sell your labor basically for money. You're just getting compensated for your labor. That's really what it should be called. It's not wages either. It's compensation for labor. But because you're a person, 14th Amendment, U.S. citizen, you're a corporation, therefore when you work, it's corporate income, corporate profits. You volunteer to pay the public debt when you apply for a Social Security number and then give it to your employer when you file a W-4 form. That you're just giving them your slave number. If you don't believe it, find a canceled check that you have written to the IRS, turn it over, and on the back you will see that the check was endorsed for deposit in a Federal Reserve account. So your check to pay your income tax was deposited into the Federal Reserve private bank, who is the creditor for the federal government. In summary, the federal government is bankrupt. The Federal Reserve is the creditor to the federal government. All your property and labor have been pledged to pay the debts of the federal government. As a United States citizen, you are held liable for the public debt.